Hey, it's Tom Jordan. You get this sense, kind of a feeling that our society is being pulled apart maybe over the past several years. Take the issue. Crime rates are going up. They've gone up. That is true. Education slipping to crisis levels. What appears to be a purposeful attempt to cast blame for personal problems on other groups of people based on maybe their ethnicity. What about casting caring parents who notice these trends as extremists and keeping them out of the loop regarding their own children based on the fact that suddenly parents are the ones who are dangerous to kids in the society? You kind of wonder what's happening here. In fact, you feel that our society even values children, that maybe they're less of a priority than in generations past. I mean, do you have kids? Because, fewer people are having kids nowadays. It's implied by, many government leaders that kids are a bit of a trap from keeping you from attaining your career goals. That freedom means aborting children at an ever increasing rate or looking at your kids based on maybe their future economic value, maybe to your family or maybe to society. That's how we view children in a sense. So in a moment, I'm going to get into this issue of maybe this correlation to the decline in birth rates in this country and increasing societal turmoil. Maybe it's more than just a correlation. In fact, maybe there's actually causation here, causality, as they like to say. That sometimes correlation does mean causality. So we're going to look into that. That children are actually at maybe the very heart of a just and enduring and meaningful society. That what we value and the value that we place on children and these relationships really underpin justice and the rule of law, and calling society to guide them towards responsible liberty and tempering their excesses and fostering moral citizenship. Maybe that plays a pretty important role. We're going to get into that in a moment, a few seconds, with Dr. Matthew Mehan, Associate Dean and Assistant Professor at Hillsdale Colleges, Steve and Amy Van Andel Graduate School of Government in Washington, D.C., in our nation's capital. Also, just a reminder to chime in. You can comment, ask questions in the comments section wherever you're watching the program, be it YouTube or X or Facebook, wherever you are right now watching. Put in a question or a comment, and we'll pose those to Dr. Mehan and however we see fit here. So just coming up in a moment. Also, the best way you can help Tom Jordan Live is simply subscribe to the podcast, click the notification bell, share the content. That helps us out a great deal and keeps us moving, keeps us alive. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. All right. Back to this whole issue. America is facing a quiet but profound crisis as birth rates continue to plummet below the replacement levels, with only 1.6 children born per woman in 2023. You get that right. This 1.6 children. That's the average, obviously. No one has a zero point 0.6 child when they're born. But you get what I'm saying here. It's not just a demographic issue either. It's a cultural and it's a civic issue, because you think about the founding fathers of this country. They understood that children are the cornerstone of a free society. They're not just future taxpayers. They saw children as vital to creating these bonds of love and duty, responsibility, justice that holds communities together, holds cities and states and really the entire republic together. You look at what John Adams, the way he described his daughter, her life and her death, and you look at George Washington and how they viewed family and really as the motivation to their lives and to taking greater responsibility for their personal duty in order to protect their children and advance their children, to teach them or give them a moral compass in life. Children are these living connections to our past, and they are investments in our future. But you look at today, and the narrative that we hear too often reduces them to, personal lifestyle choices. So we have these falling birth rates. So we have fewer citizens to really uphold family values or America's ideals of justice and liberty and self-governance. And this really comes down to an issue of national survival. Strong families raise children who respect law, they cherish freedom, they resist tyranny, all of these things. And without children on our side, essentially, the society is going to unravel. I want to get into this again with a Dr. Matthew Mehan with he's written about this, and it's a great article, and you can find him. He's with Hillsdale College. He's the associate dean, the assistant professor at Hillsdale College's Steve and Amy Van Andel Graduate School of Government in Washington D.C. Dr. Meehan, it's great to have you back in the program. Thanks for your time, and thanks for writing about this very important issue.
No, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
What is? I mean, just start off, I guess, with this. What's how has our view of children, you think, in our society changed in this country over the past few decades, do you think?
So they've ceased to be a kind of end, or you could say an end in themselves, but also a means to the pursuit of happiness for many.
Hmm.
And that seems to me to be a pretty big shift, and a pretty profound misunderstanding when you think that in the founding era, and I think long into the 20th century, uh, the good, the joy, and the sort of wonderful transcendence of children uh, was a self-evident truth, if you want to use some founding language. And it's funny, just even in your setup listening, it's actually kind of hard to talk about this because it's so self-evidently the case. You almost sort of run out of words because you're like, yeah, they're good. They're obviously good. They're lovable. They're wonderful. They're sort of the purpose of family life. They're the purpose of adults. They're the purpose of government to raise the next generation and help them do likewise. So I think there has been a sea change for some, and that's the hopeful side. That it's not the entire nation hasn't embraced that sort of ideology that displaces children as a kind of companion animal or accessory handbag or sort of an accoutrement to your
Yeah,
delightful
exactly.
life in the city, right?
Right. It sounds like a puppy you can put in your purse. Look what I have today as you're going out. I don't know how to describe it either because it's strange to me because nobody openly admits that we don't value children. They all come out and say, no, children are so important. But they go about it in strange different ways. Like, the old traditional way of valuing children where the mother and the father are essential in the home and they're the ones who really should be in charge of their children's lives, these, under 18 individuals. But now you have this kind of ideal in schools and in government, in the far left progressives, that no, actually, it quote unquote takes a village. And what they mean by that is that the government needs to get more involved in raising your children. So they need to provide the child care. They need to kind of keep parents out of the equation more so because they're claiming that they care more about your kids than you do. So how do you? I don't know how you describe that, but what are the implications of that, or maybe the ramifications of that mentality on a
Yeah,
society? If the government thinks they should be the ones raising your kids and not the parents.
I've written elsewhere on this for Real Clear Education on in loco parentis, right?
Hmm.
That famous old common law phrase, like in the place of the parents, and the way the state and is particularly public education right now, the way the state is interpreting that phrase is like, no, 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 we are in the place of parents. And like, no, no, no. When you say that phrase, what you really mean is you are going to take over briefly as a kind of secondary educator because we understand that by nature, the natural affections, even of adoptive parents, by the way, it's not genetics. It's just they live in your home, you take care of them, you love them to death, literally, right? You would die for your children, right? Be they your natural or adoptive, like you take on that relationship of love. And because of that, you know them, you live with them, you take care of them, you nurse them in the night, you know their nightmares, right? You know their fears and their loves. You're the best person to help them. And that entire insight of parents being the primary educator, because as I like to say, love is a kind of expertise, and parental love gives parents expert opinions about their own children. Uh, that's another whole avenue of sort of corruption of the understanding, appreciation, and reverence for the family and familial relationship between mother and father
Hmm.
and their child. Um,
Yeah.
but it expands beyond that too, and I mean we can get into it later. But you mentioned in your setup, it actually, those relationships are the beginning of justice, duty, and citizenship too. Like, you don't have a country if you don't do this kind of familial work of love.
Mm. That's so important because you go back to our founding fathers. You know, you mentioned, John Adams, you mentioned George Washington, and the way they viewed children is really essentially how they decided to form our government. It was based on the most important government is that of one's family and the parents and the child, the relationship there. So, what is it about that, and why is the United States unique in this approach? Because I think we may have been really, I mean, what we no means is Western society. I don't want people to confuse what I'm saying here. Are we the ones that invented family? There's this narrative out there that somehow, Western society and Western cultures, this is kind of a white supremacist way of viewing children and family. No, this has been the way it's been since the very beginning. But our government was founded in such a way to emphasize that and learn the lessons of family in order to establish a government that reflects the family values. I mean, can you kind of elaborate on what I'm trying to say here?
Yeah, the genius of the American founding, in some respect, rests in its understanding of limited government. But limited government doesn't make any sense unless there's something else that fulfills your life. And that is family and God, right? There's three parts: God, country, family, right? Or family, country, God, or however up and down the chain of goods you want to go. But by choosing a kind of limited government, even the states, right? Their constitutions, states have more police power, but even they limit themselves tremendously and protect the natural rights of their citizens and their property, such that there's a zone of social and private life. But private, in one sense, is a dangerous way to think about it, as if it were somehow selfishly just yours or not also related to public and communal life, right? There is a kind of society that isn't just the government, right? I remember, I forget who it was, but someone said the government is just what we do together. You're like, well, sort of. That's true, because
Yeah.
politics affects everything, and I I'm a professor of government. You make a law in Congress and it affects everybody. You can't get away from politics. It's not like there's a zone that's not political, right? But the government limits itself so that you can freely pursue happiness through these beautiful relationships of love, which
Mm,
predominantly, fundamentally, and by the way, necessarily must come out of family bonds. And
mm,
that's another part of this, I think, why the ideology has gone crazy is we have trained generations now of young people. And again, not all of them, thank God. But we have trained generations of young people that their nature, right, the so-called limits of their body are a chain, a prison, and they want to break free of that, as opposed to it's literally a beautiful tour guide map of how to be happy and how to end well and even get to an afterlife well, right?
yeah.
Your nature is a wonderful thing, and the nature of man and woman is that we are family, that we make babies, love them, raise them, and build out from there into community through marriage. And this is what Cicero, the great Republican theorist that all the founding fathers quoted from memory constantly during the founding era, he called it the complex of charity, the complexa caritatis, right? There's this 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 huge engine underneath any kind of state or governmental law that comes down. it, that law is a bad law if it descends to secure something that doesn't exist. But what it secures beneath it, right? Or you could even say above it, right? In a certain sense, there's this, like, you're supporting with law these loves. And so we've forgotten that children and the love of family that grows out into community is kind of the whole show in a way. And that's what I tried to write in this piece for the Heritage Foundation, which, by the way, I'm very pleased that they asked me to do this. I've been talking a lot about this with them, but it was their idea to commission the article, and I commend Kevin Roberts and Brenda Farah and the others there. John Malcolm and others. But I wanted to. People have reacted to the article in a funny way that I think is worth commenting for your viewers and listeners, which is they're like, oh, if you have to make the argument for the self-evident goodness of children, then you have a sick society. I actually think it's the reverse. I actually think it's the reverse. The fact that they're having me write this and that I'm writing this and that people are reading it and we're talking about it is exactly what healthy society did all the time. Do you think during the founding era, people didn't talk about children and the goodness of family all the time to
Right.
perpetuate and continue and remind the next generation to do these good things for their happiness and the benefit of all? Like, this is health, actually, is talking about
Yes.
these.
It's like saying that, argumentation means that you're not a united country, that the best way to unite the country is to censor people. And we've talked about that on this program in the past as well. It's a grave misunderstanding of what freedom and civil liberties looks like. And I think argumentation is a huge part of this and discussing things openly, such as the importance of children. And you wrote about, I mean, it's a great piece. I'm glad that, you and Hillsdale partnered with the Heritage Foundation on this because it was an important thing for you to write and for us to keep talking about. And you talk about in your article, you emphasize how a child's entrance into this world creates numerous new relationships. One single child creates all these different relationships that form the foundation, you say, of justice and law. How does that happen? How do these bonds of affection, as you describe it, and duty that are I guess nurtured within this child relationship? How does that end up contributing to this thriving democratic republic that we live in?
So everybody loves a baby, right? like,
Yes.
like they do, right? Like the grandma loves a baby, uncle loves a baby, aunt loves a baby, right? Brother loves a baby, sister loves a baby, mom and dad, etc. Right? So once you have a baby, and you mentioned abortion, which is why, in one sense, it's such a tragedy, even beyond the actual problem of taking life. It's a tragedy because it basically cuts off all of this interconnectedness. People wonder why society is fracturing, right? It's people are saying no to relationships, right? That's another part at the root and core of the abortion issue. But for the most part, once a baby is out in the world, everybody loves a baby. And they all then take care of that baby, serve that baby, right? Countless nights. I mean, I've got a bunch of kids. I'm up late, taking
Mhm.
care of them
Yeah.
or waiting for my teenager to come home from the party, etc. And make sure they're okay, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, and I've got little ones too. So you give and you give and you give, and the child then grows up and sees all of these people who have given and given and given, both in the family, their parents, but also the guy who paved the roads and built the bridge, Abraham Lincoln, who was shot to bring liberty to the slaves and keep the Union together during the Civil War. Right, you start looking around and seeing all these people who sacrificed to bring you the goods of this world, and that creates bonds of love and appreciation, and then duty. And thus, then you're like, okay, now I have to do right by this place, and I have to treat people with a certain dignity, and protect them and their property and their life and their liberties. And so that's the foundation of all law and all justice, is this engine of charity, self-giving, and then the recognition that others have given themselves for you and for the others, which then causes a response of love and duty. And that's it. That's the whole show. And
Yeah,
I
that's
think
such
we've just grievously forgotten it.
Yeah, that's such a Christian ideal too, because you think about what Jesus said. We the disciples were basically writing about the fact that we love God because God first loved us. It causes this response, and when you think of the founding fathers like George Washington and you mentioned Abigail Adams and John Adams and all these individuals who gave their lives for their country. Well, what was the motivation behind that? It's because they loved their children, and that caused them to give of themselves. And nothing is more selfless, I think, than raising a child. I mean, you mentioned yourself, you're getting up at all hours of the night. If your kid is throwing up on teachers at school in the fourth grade, you're going to go and pick up that kid from the fourth grade, take him home so he or she could throw up on you. I mean, that's
Yeah,
the whole
exactly.
idea behind it. It's a sacrifice and sacrificial living, which we learn, I think, in no better way than the raising of children, just like we were raised by sacrificial parents. So this is what keeps us moving along. So is that, do you think? I mean, you're right about the fact that, George Washington, these great figures and fathers of this nation, that is what truly motivated them to give of their lives to this great country.
Yeah, and it paradoxically it both does that, and certainly, and I think the I studied the letters of the founders on their children, and sort of teased out those arguments, which you can read in the article, and you kind of represented them well enough right there. I do think there's a paradox, though, which is interesting. Namely, not only does it cause this incredible sense of duty and sacrifice to secure the blessings of liberty, right, which they did in spades with risking their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor, etc. The other thing it does is it also gives you an experience that there's something beyond politics, right? You hold
Mhm.
a baby, you see your son graduate from high school or college, you watch them get married, right? You watch them get baptized, whatever it is, right? You have these powerful experiences of the transcendent, because
Yes.
both the
Yes.
Christian faith and Greek philosophy teaches that God puts an immortal soul in a human being. There's something transcendent in every human being. And that causes you to see government as a limited good that is only for this life and that is important, but is not the most important thing. And
That
that experience, I think, is another part of why our limited government republic, in a certain sense, responds to our very nature and the nature of family and the experience that families have in raising their children, which is a kind of encounter with the divine through their child, right? The spark.
Absolutely. That is so profound what you just said. And I just had, the whole transcendence and purpose and the experience of raising children and be a part of their lives. And I just had an experience where I just walked my daughter down the aisle in September, and in that moment, it was a surreal moment, and I didn't expect to feel that way as I was walking her down the aisle. But I was reduced to tears because I realized how profound this moment was. And when you're a young father and the child is born, you're thinking, one day I'm going to walk her down the aisle. And here it is. And you're kind of setting her off into her own life and to start her own family. And I experienced that with my oldest son as well. It's amazing how our purpose is so much greater than our career or our making of, money, whatever we prioritize in the society. You mentioned that, the abortion issue, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but I know in 2023, in the state of Michigan alone, not talking about the country, but just one of the 50 states in Michigan, there were more than 30,000 abortions in 1 year, and that number keeps going up. And at the same time, studies were coming out that all these journalists and these government officials were profoundly perplexed on what to do with the falling birth rates in Michigan. Like, what are we going to, how is this happening? And I was covering this at the station I was working at the time, and the reporters were like, yeah, we're all trying to figure it out. And I thought, well, what about the issue of abortion? Well, we don't want to go there. I'm like, why not? Isn't that directly tied to a decreasing birth rate? If there are fewer people being born and there are more people being aborted, so, on that issue, how do you foresee that affecting our society? That issue of abortion or declining birth rates?
I think people are going to have to make these kinds of arguments, uh, and round out the argument that every life is precious. Uh, and and I will say this: I think the pro-life movement could do with taking a slightly lower rhetorical style sometimes. Uh, Obviously, there's going to be changes of heart and mind that's going to require, religious conversion, right? Mugged by reality, all kinds of things. Just the component that we're talking about, which is the talking about it and sort of the proposals of how to live together. But I do think you have to make those arguments, and they're an important component. But why not show everyone that it's greatly to their advantage? And that's what I try to do in the piece. Like, look, it's not just that you get workers to fill the social security coffers. Although, if you're a crass person and that's all you care about, like, fine. Like, and that's not unimportant. Like, you if you do abort the race, right,
Mm.
of men, right? If all human beings are aborted, right, you can't have all of these social safety nets when you're old. FYI, I don't think
Right.
that's an illegitimate argument to make to a pro-abortion person from the pro-life side. But also, not just that, it's also a hopeless society. It's an unhappy society. It's an unlimited governmental society. You lose your liberties. Why don't the libertarians get on board and realize that an abortive society is one that becomes a statist society?
Mm.
So if you want to have your freedoms, you'd best have a robust private social society that has lots of energy in it. And if you don't, everyone will turn to the government for that energetic power of protection, because you can't rely on your uncle, your aunt, your three brothers, et cetera, right? If you
Mm.
don't have family, you're going
Right.
to have government. So I think there's a lot of sort of lower persuasive arguments that we could be making. I chose in this case to make a kind of higher pitch, but each of the high pitches in my piece are related to these lower order issues as well.
Yeah, that's so amazing how you tie all these issues together. We don't often think about that. I don't often think about the fact that when we get old and we don't have children or we don't have uncles and aunts, and we are going to be dependent upon the government to take care of us, and that's going to perpetuate, and it's going to become the cycle that we can't probably get out of. You talk in your piece also about the importance of education and preserving education, and I've watched over the past several years our educational system in Michigan and California in this country just fall by the wayside, and we're throwing money at a problem that just keeps getting worse and worse. How are we not prioritizing education? How can we better prioritize education for the young in order to safeguard all these America's democratic ideals for 5, 10, 15 years down the road?
Yeah, so I do. I sit on Hillsdale's K-12 advisory board, and I've been designing curricula for years. I helped work on our 1776 curriculum, which is all
Hmm.
free, by the way, on our website, K through 12. So I've this has been one of my particular professional passions is civic education, but liberal arts education, the arts of liberty, as I like to retranslate the old phrase. Uh, I, I do think that one of the things is that's needed is a comfort with the moral aspects of reading, writing, and arithmetic. There was, I think, a time when everybody said, "Okay, let's not have any ideological or moral fights, and let's just teach the three R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic." But I think certain people, I think I would say principally on the sort of Marxist or socialist progressive left, uh, took advantage of that and said, well, it turns out they're going to have to read something, write something, and
Mm.
count something. So,
Mm.
what are they going to read, write, and count? And we'll just mess with all of that. But it turns out what you read is in part what you hear and see that forms your moral imagination and your opinions about right and wrong, justice and goodness. So, I do think we need to become much more engaged. And I think you see that at the very baseline with some of the Moms for Liberty and school board fights over really grotesque books that are sort of pornographic. But that
Mhm.
is, in one sense, the a rear guard action, the very last sort of redoubt, the Alamo, if you will. If you really want to take the fight out onto the battlefield and away from the castle keep, you need to say, you know what, public schools, you should be teaching basic human ethics of natural reason. That's not establishment of religion. Just because the Ten Commandments mention it too doesn't mean it's not in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or in Cicero's On Duties or in Seneca, right? Like there are good moral teachings which we used to give everybody, regardless of their faith, that was a kind of stepping stone to the formation that they would get from church and from Christ. And we need to be much more comfortable insisting on some of that, even in our public education. The immortality of the soul, like we were talking about earlier, that's something
Mhm.
that everyone should be taught
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
that's a philosophical principle. It's real. It's
Yes.
hard, but so is particle physics. But we teach the kids that in high school, right? Like we should be seriously forming them about our nature and what that nature prescribes for a happy life.
Oh,
And
it's
I think
it's beautiful.
that's one aspect of the change, which I'll mention.
Well, I commend you for doing the work you've done with the K through 12 education because now I know a number of people who've gone through the classical academies that are popping up around this country, and they're sponsored by Hillsdale College, and K through 12 is imperative. And so I would recommend people check out if there's a classical academy in your community, which there are more and more. I know there's some in Michigan. I got a friend who's one of the head guys at one in Fargo, North Dakota, of all places. So you're expanding throughout. I think I commend you for your work with the 1776 project and that as well. We do have a comment or maybe a question here that somebody wants to pose to you. So let's bring that up here. Cameron Harris is watching it, and it is from Harry Sakali, and Harry is back. Good morning, Tom. Good morning, Harry. It seems to me that the devaluing of children in the USA started in the 1970s when the word DINK, dual income, no kids, was coined. It translated to no kids equals the good life. Very sad. Thanks, Harry Sakalian. Do you see that too, Doctor?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like different waves, and sometimes we successfully repel the wave, and other times we do not. So I think that was a wave we didn't very successfully repel. But I mean, it's a perennial problem, right? I mean, you go back to the Babylonians or the Baal worshippers, like sacrifice a child
Mm,
to Moloch and your crops
yes.
will do well, right? Sort of, you can live the good life if you just give up kids, right? So
Yeah.
there's this temptation that is perennial because kids are difficult and cause pain. But this is another part of what I think is the moral miseducation of America. We don't understand that pain isn't something to be avoided like a rat avoiding a trap. Pain is actually the sort of pigmentation, the paint we paint our masterpiece with, right?
Mm,
We make a life using suffering and sacrifice to do beautiful and good things. You can't have the virtue of courage, which is the willingness to sustain a wound without some pain. No pain,
mm,
no gain. I mean, every
mm,
football coach knows that. But for some reason, we tend to see pleasure, uh, as this um, idol that we should pursue. And then we see children who cause us a lot of front end pain, right, to take care of them, and go, yeah, 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 no, I don't want that. But it's
yeah.
really short term thinking uh, when in fact the pleasures, the higher pleasures of having lived well and live in love and die in love uh, with a family around you, those are profound.
Oh yeah,
And
if people can, I think if people can grab onto that concept that actually life is not meant to be without suffering and pain and difficulty. In fact, that's a very much a big part of the fabric of life. If they can grab onto that and embrace it, the Bible talks about when you're suffering or persecuted, rejoice in that Jesus was this great example of suffering. He did it knowing that that was the way to live as an example unto us. And I think if that was the case, that we would see suicide rates drop in this country. So it would just go off the cliff in terms of the suicidal ideation that a lot of people are struggling with because suffering and difficulty is something that makes you a stronger individual internally. And I think it's very profound what you just said there. I know you got to run. I just appreciate your time here. I want to ask you one final, I guess, how would you wrap this up? Like the whole thesis of your piece that you wrote for the Heritage Foundation regarding children, is direct correlation and really a causation to a more prosperous society.
I think I would just sort of follow up on a conversation we had before the show briefly, uh, which is it really matters that we say these things to each other and to the next generation. Uh, People think that people are just going to do what people are going to do, but it turns out people are social. People do are hardwired for love and unity and community, and so we have to bring these things up. We have to talk about them, and even I think you've done this in a variety of ways, and you've got to keep doing it, and more creatively, and more incessantly. We have to actually sort of tweak our politicians uh,
Yeah.
to
Yes.
talk about this and think about this and take it seriously. And we have to push past sort of people mocking it as like, oh, this is just nativistic, natalist nationalism. You're like, yeah, natus, 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 i.e., you don't like babies being born, right? That's
Right.
all of those words come from the Latin word for natal, like for a baby being born. Like, we're not racist because we want more American babies, right?
Right.
Of all races, okay? So we have to just keep talking about it. And I mean, read the piece. Please do. You can follow me on Twitter at MTMehan, Mehan. But, and I tweet it out there occasionally for the next couple of weeks. But it's the creating the political and social climate where this is happiness and this is joy and this is the path to
Mm,
pursue happiness as an American. We need to get back to that. It was our way
yeah.
of life. It is still our way of life for some of America. We need to make it the supermajority yet again.
Yeah, wow, what a great way to say it. The Bible says, "Blessed is the man whose quiver is full." Blessed meaning happy, and quiver is full, referring to children. It's very important and a well written piece, and I thank you so much for joining us to talk about it. Dr. Matthew Mehan is I've written about this very important topic, and of course, the Associate Dean and Assistant Professor at Hillsdale College's Steve and Amy Van Andel Graduate School of Government in Washington, D.C. Doctor, it's so good to see you again. Thanks for your time. We'll talk again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, very much.
Appreciate it. Yeah, enjoy your day. Yeah, I had a conversation, and part of the conversation that Dr. Meehan and I had prior to our this interview was about this real neglect of addressing this issue of marriage and children and family as really a societal issue. That if we emphasize the importance of family, is actually good for the economy. And in the state of Michigan, in which I live, there is a population decline here happening, and they have determined that it's buried in the study, but far down in the study is that the people who are staying in Michigan, who are not leaving, are the ones who get married young and start having kids like in their early 20s. Those people are staying and they're thriving and they're being a very important part of our culture and society. So I asked one of the people that's trying to figure out how we can reduce the population declines, like, have you thought about maybe encouraging marriage and having children early on instead of, staving that off until you're in your mid 30s or late 30s where it might be too late to have children? They said, well, we can't do that. We can't force people to, what are we going to have, arranged marriages? Which I thought what a ridiculous response. Of course, they're not going to be forced in arranged marriages. It's the message we're sending to our society that marriage and children are very important. They are the fabric of who we are. And so let's encourage that. Instead of saying, you should get an abortion because that's the road to freedom, meaning somehow that having a career without kids is the happy way to go, and ignoring all the data that's out there shows no, actually, the opposite is true. And that's another discussion for another day in terms of the real anguish and depression and anxiety that develops from as the increase, there's an increase in the abortion rate in the state and in this country. But having children, yeah, it's difficult, it's hard, there is sacrifice involved, but it is the road and the pathway to not only a successful society, but inner happiness. And that word blessed means happiness. Those who are happy are the ones who are blessed because their quiver is full. So I think this is such a cornerstone issue to our societal ills, whether you're a Christian or not. The truth is the truth, and this is what benefits society. So, thanks to Hillsdale and Heritage for prioritizing this issue. When we think of children in the context of society, too often the conversation veers towards, the practicality aspects of it, the birth rates, the economic contributions, workforce replenishment. But if you take a step back and you ask yourself, is that all children represent, or are they something far more profound, far more central to the moral and political health of a country? And consider this: every child born creates an entire web of relationships. Parents, siblings, neighbors, citizens. I have seen firsthand a family come back together and relationships be restored from a parent to a child to a grandparent when another baby is born. And the family unites around the newborn baby, and they all want to be together again. These connections are incredibly foundational, and they're essentially the foundation of justice and the rule of law. You want your kids to behave and to treat others well. That's the rule of law. That's justice. And justice at its core is relational. It's not some abstract, ethereal concept. It's how we treat one another. And it's how we honor obligations, how we ensure fairness, and who better than children to remind of us of this of that. Their needs are pretty profound, and they're staring right in there for your face, right in front of you. Their vulnerabilities as well. They are dependent. It's why the IRS calls them dependents, because they need somebody. They are dependent on someone else doing their duty to care for another. So all of this compels us to temper our excesses in life, the selfishness, and gives us a greater priority of responsibility in life. Their dependence reminds us that freedom isn't about doing whatever we please, despite what maybe a governor of a state like Michigan will say. That's not freedom. Freedom is about choosing to do what is good and right. You have the freedom now to do what is best, what's good and right for your own child. And the founders of this country understood this very well, almost intuitively. George Washington, he mourned the loss of his stepdaughter, describing a sorrow that is deeper than words. My wife and I lost a child too, and it is incredibly difficult to go through. That is a very, very sorrowful experience. John Adams, he said he found consolation in the moral legacy his children represented. And these men didn't just see children as the next generation of workers or soldiers. They saw them as the embodiment of a just and enduring society. Children in their lives grounded their pursuit of happiness. It wasn't material gain, but it was in relationships, love, duty, service. And then you juxtapose that with today's cultural drift. Birth rates are falling. The family unit is increasingly undervalued. Families are falling apart. We told children that they're a choice. They're a lifestyle accessory rather than an indispensable pillar of a community and a nation. But if we lose sight of their higher purpose, if we see them only as economic factors or personal preferences, what happens to the moral cohesion of our society? So this question is pretty critical. How do we preserve a republic that prizes liberty and justice if we undermine the very relationships that sustain those ideals? So I guess the call out today, and the reason why I brought this up today, is because I read Dr. Mehan's piece. I was so moved by it, and I agree wholeheartedly with it, that if we were going to have true happiness in our life, we need to understand that the difficulty of service, of serving one another, gives us a greater purpose in life. Is this transcendent purpose? It's not about me. It's not about you specifically. It's about us all together. And does it take a village? Not in the way that Hillary Clinton meant it. No, it doesn't take. Government is important, but the government doesn't step in and provide your children everything he or she needs. You do as a parent. You can do it with sacrifice and the help that only God can provide. So we need to protect those, and that ends up benefiting all of us, including our entire educational system, which, as the government has taken more and more control over your education has declined to a crisis level. All right, so let's talk about some headlines here, and we'll get your comments in a moment. This Zuckerberg statement yesterday, I was relieved, actually. Mark Zuckerberg is ending the Facebook fact-checking and admits it was a tool for censorship. Yeah, that's what Mark Zuckerberg said, and I want to play you this clip of Mark Zuckerberg, what he said, and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
So we're going to get back to our roots and focus on reducing mistakes, simplifying our policies, and restoring free expression on our platforms. More specifically, here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to get rid of fact checkers and replace them with community notes similar to X, starting in the US. After Trump first got elected in 2016, the legacy media wrote nonstop about how misinformation was a threat to democracy. We tried in good faith to address those concerns without becoming the arbiters of truth. But the fact checkers have just been too politically biased and have destroyed more trust than they've created, especially in the US. So over the next couple of months, we're going to phase in a more comprehensive community notes system. Second, we're going to simplify our content policies and get rid of a bunch of restrictions on topics like immigration and gender that are just out of touch with mainstream discourse. What started as a movement to be more inclusive has increasingly been used to shut down opinions and shut out people with different ideas, and it's gone too far. So I want to make sure that people can share their beliefs and experiences on our platforms. Third, we're changing how we enforce our policies to reduce the mistakes that account for the vast majority of censorship on our platforms. We used to have filters that scanned for any policy violation. Now, we're going to focus those filters on tackling illegal and high-severity violations. And for lower severity violations, we're going to rely on someone reporting an issue before we take action. The problem is that the filters make mistakes, and they take down a lot of content that they shouldn't. So by dialing them back, we're going to dramatically reduce the amount of censorship on our platforms. We're also going to tune our content filters to require much higher confidence before taking down content. The reality is that this is a trade-off. It means we're going to catch less bad stuff, but we'll also reduce the number of innocent people's posts and accounts that we accidentally take down. Fourth, we're bringing back civic content. For a while, the community asked to see less politics because it was making people stressed. So we stopped recommending these posts. But it feels like we're in a new era now, and we're starting to get feedback that people want to see this content again. So we're going to start phasing this back into Facebook, Instagram, and Threads while working to keep the communities friendly and positive. Fifth, we're going to move our trust and safety and content moderation teams out of California, and our US-based content review is going to be based in Texas. As we work to promote free expression, I think that it will help us build trust to do this work in places where there is less concern about the bias of our teams. Finally, we're going to work with President Trump to push back on governments around the world that are going after American companies and pushing to censor more.
Yeah, so do you see what he admitted there? That the American companies the American government and governments around the world are pushing these companies like Facebook very hard to censor opinions and certain speech. So I love what he said there. I don't believe everything you said. Like, I don't think that Facebook accidentally took down posts that they disagreed with. I think it was very purposeful over the past many, many different years, because he was making similar promises like this back, 5 or 6 years ago. That they're not going. And when he had shorter hair, I think he was saying this stuff wasn't happening. But then he did testify just a few years ago when he had shorter hair in front of Congress, saying that the Department of Justice and the Biden administration has been pushing us hard to censor content. It was a direct violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution. And we know this has been going on, but of course the media out there who also censors people have not been covering this as they should. So I applaud Mark Zuckerberg for coming out, saying he's going to meet with Donald Trump to make sure that governments don't do what they've been doing for the past several years, aka the Biden administration. So if you are of the belief, he mentioned gender in here, if you are of the belief that a man cannot be pregnant, then you will not be censored, it sounds like, any longer for your extremist views, is what Mark Zuckerberg is saying there. So they're ditching this controversial third-party fact-checking program. Thank you for that, because he just admitted right there, he knows full well that these fact-checkers are incredibly biased. They are not correctly and accurately fact-checking the facts. And the fact checkers are furious right now because they made quite a good living doing this over the past several years. And the biased fact checkers are saying, that's not true. We are not biased, say the biased fact checkers. So you can't trust them. And he says that they've pretty much, they've caused the American people to completely mistrust these so-called fact checkers that CNN uses, MSNBC uses, all of, CBS. Fact checkers say that men can become pregnant. So those types of things are going to go away by the wayside. And listen, he admits that Facebook censored, they fostered censorship within their company. And he also said that, listen, we're going to do it the way that X is doing it now, because the community knows a far better way to more effectively combat untruths or quote unquote disinformation by people out there in the real world who know what they're talking about, rather than those in Silicon Valley. And good for him for moving these so-called content moderators, arbiters of truth, out of California and moving them to where? Moving them to Texas. Very interesting what's happening with Mark Zuckerberg. I have the opinion that there's a mix going on with him because he's still, I think, a liberal individual. But I think he's been disillusioned, just like so many people in this country have been, with what's been happening. And he can see he more than others can see what the government is doing because they're doing it directly with him and with his company. So I think he's been listening to guys, with he's been listening to Donald Trump. He's been, when Donald Trump was nearly assassinated, and Donald Trump got back and pumped his fist in the air with blood running down from his ear. Mark Zuckerberg said that is the most bad ASS thing that I've ever seen. And I think he was thinking, whoa, they actually really did just try to kill him. So this is more serious than maybe I realized. That's my theory of what's happening, this kind of transition, if you will, that Mark Zuckerberg is undergoing right now. So he's changing. What's the guy with UFC? I don't know, Dana White. Yeah. He and Dana White are good buddies. And so Dana White, I think, is getting into his ear as well, saying, Mark, you've been duped by these far left progressives. They're the extremists. These conservatives actually care about people and free speech. The things that you thought you cared about, free speech and individual liberties, that's actually the conservatives. So let's not suppress them any longer. Anyway, I think that's what's going on. All right. Speaking of a conservative, Donald Trump, America First guy, he's this is a speech he gave the other day on C-SPAN covered it, as did the New York Post. You can see there. President-elect Donald Trump announced on yesterday, that the Gulf of Mexico would be renamed the Gulf of America. He called it a beautiful name. And Trump reignited these debates about, reclaiming U.S. identity and sovereignty, and prompting this, swift legislative action from Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's a Republican out of Georgia. She is a staunch conservative, and she's now going, okay, let's do this. So Marjorie Taylor Greene wasted no time declaring her intent to codify the name change. The Gulf of America shall be the name everyone uses, is what she stated regards to this. Her proposal is slated for filing tomorrow on Thursday. It emphasizes updating all federal maps and documents to reflect the change. And in a fiery statement, MTG, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she cited national security as a key driver to all this, and she was lambasting the Mexican drug cartels for exploiting the Gulf's waters for human and drug trafficking. She's right about that. She said the American people are footing the bill to protect this maritime region while the Mexican government enables criminal activity. And she's like, the U.S. military, the dominance of the U.S. military justifies the rebranding of that Gulf. So the announcement, there's some enthusiasm behind it among the GOP lawmakers. We have got Greg Steube, representative out of Florida, Republican. He urged Americans to take a dip in the Gulf of America, is the way he put it. Meantime, Senator Tommy Tuberville from Alabama, he loves this idea. He says it's a fitting acknowledgement of the Gulf's significance to U.S. commerce and defense. The proposal is already energizing supporters of it. They see this as a symbolic stand for American pride and ownership. And that's in addition to Donald Trump's talk about buying Greenland and maybe doing something with the Panama Canal. That was a huge mistake. We sold the Panama Canal to Panama for $1 in the Jimmy Carter administration. And why did we do that? We just gave them a huge gift to a corrupt nation, essentially, and a corrupt area in this incredibly important port down there that we built. And thousands of American lives were lost to building that, and the amount of money we paid for that. So, Gulf of America, just one of the geographical change that Donald Trump would like to make. All right, do you have any comments here? Let's see if Cameron can bring anything up. Comments? There's Arlene. Hi, Arlene. Good to see you again. Thomas Jefferson's goal was to have a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government. That is so good. Think about that. Who is really taking away from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned? Is it the evil corporations that the unions like to say, or is it the government itself? And I would argue, I think Arlene makes this argument as well because she agrees with Thomas Jefferson, it's the government. It's an out-of-control authoritarian regime. And it's gotten way out of control. So, Arlene, thanks for that great point. Let's bring up another comment here. R. Paulus is back. Hi, R. Paulus. The welfare state has something to do with it. I believe not directly in America, perhaps, but in Europe, when we've been Europeized. We have been Europeized, and we need to get away from that. And I had a conversation with Marianne Williamson. She was a candidate for president, too, and she says, we need to be more like Europe. And I thought, didn't we leave Europe for a very specific reason? Because they were too authoritarian? Yeah, let's not be more like Europe. Thank you. Good comment. Thanks so much. Let's bring up another comment here. This one is from the engineer is back. What up, buddy? The engineer. Never forget my son graduated from med school and got married. Youngest daughter accepted to medical school. Middle daughter graduated West Point. Wow. Oldest daughter stationed in Guam, and oldest son died in Iraq. I'm sorry that you lost your oldest son in Iraq, the engineer. I was not aware of that. But you're grateful and proud. That's the thing, isn't it? The engineer, the pride that is transcendent above all these other things that some of these far left liberals tell us we have to live by. And that family is not, although they won't admit this out loud, what they're really telling us is family is not as important as your freedom and your career. Believe me, I know that's how they think. Thanks, the engineer. My condolences. And thanks for your son's service and your other kids' service as well. Amazing. One more comment, and then we'll have to say so long here. R. Paulus is back. Zuck is not innocent. He willingly pushed the narrative. He resisted nothing from the dens. You're right. He's not innocent here. I'm relieved that now he's turning. But, he's not innocent. He was very much entrenched in this. He hid this from the American people. We all knew full well that Facebook, if you're a conservative and you said anything that was disagreeable with a far extremist left, you were silenced, you were censored, you were throttled, so to speak. Nobody can see your posts. They were very active in doing this. And there's no question that Mark Zuckerberg was at the heart of this. He complied with authoritarian government representatives from the Department of Justice and the FBI and who else, as he probably met with Joe Biden during the past, and maybe Kamala Harris regarding this. But that's important to remember. But if he's turning, I welcome that turn and that change for the better of this country and for the better of dialogue that allows us all to disagree agreeably with each other. All right, that's going to be it for this edition of Tom Joe Live. I want to thank you so much for being a part of the program. Check us out on, of course, Facebook, X, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And remember, please share the content. If you found any benefit to you, maybe someone else will as well. Thanks so much. God bless you. We'll see you back here tomorrow.